You can see these cooling louvers. They are on a swivel shutter, so you can actually close these up if you need more protection from airburst or aircraft attack. Underneath, you can see the large flywheel, which of course transmits the power back to the transmission. If you look down the very far bottom, you can see the control linkages for the clutches and brakes. There's one on each side, obviously for steering. You can also see the two multi-cyclone air filters. Unfortunately, if you've got to change these air filters out, and you have to do it usually every 25 hours, you have to pull out these armoured louvers first. That will then allow you to access the air filters. It's not the end of the world because there's only a couple of bolts on each side, but it's still a nuisance that you don't really want to deal with all that much. The maintenance on this is a little bit intensive. After only 10 hours of use, you're supposed to check the clutch plate and make sure it goes 6 to 7 millimeters. If you're lucky enough to get your engine going 25 hours, you gotta clean out your air filters. If your tank lasts for 50 hours of travel or 1,000 kilometers, then things really start getting nasty. You have to start disassembling the suspension to get at them. However, if you're lucky, your tank won't last that long. You won't have to do the maintenance, just go get another tank. There's a lot of ways of almost falling off this tank, by the way. It's not quite as bad as Matilda, but it's pretty nasty. And thus ends part 1. So part 2, of course, turret and inside.
The M10 was the final result of a series of vehicles intended to give the tank destroyer branch a bigger gun. It was only an expedient vehicle. Tank destroyers actually wanted something much more mobile, but they needed something now, and the 3-inch gun motor carriages T24, M5, and M9 didn't make the mustard. As a result, M10 was put into service. A lot of them did find their way across the water in Commonwealth service. The M10s were there known as Gun 3-inch anti-tank on self-propelled mount M10. There was for the British, however, a bit of a problem. The 3-inch gun was the only one of its type in British service. As a result, this led to logistical problems and training problems, and it just wasn't worth the hassle. It's actually pretty similar to the problem they had with the 76mm Sherman. Perfectly fine system, but it used ammunition which was not readily available in the British system. The result was pretty much the same for both. Remove the 3-inch high velocity, or the 76, and replace it with a 17-pounder. Now, yes, the Firefly was a different turret, but you get the gist. It didn't hurt that the 17-pounder also had a very significant punch, but the important part was that it was in British service, with being produced in British factories, ammunition was easy to come by, and it was in the supply system. Vehicles which had been converted were known as Gun 17-pounder anti-tank on self-propelled mount M10. Very creative name. After a while, the British decided they actually needed something a little bit catchier and shorter, and they came up with the name Achilles in early 1945. In order to distinguish between the different marks of M10, the Achilles Mark I was the M10 equivalent with a twin diesel engine. The Achilles Mark II was the version with the Ford V8. The Americans would know it as the M10A1. If it had a 17-pounder, they added the identifier C, the letter C. This was the standard nomenclature for a vehicle which had a 17-pounder on it. So, for example, the Sherman Firefly was known as the Sherman, say, 5C. As a result, the vehicle I'm standing in front of is an Achilles Mark I-C. Now, the astute of you will notice looking at the mantlet that was actually not the end of the upgrades that this vehicle received, but we'll get to that a little later. As we start our tour of the hull, it occurs to me that things are going to start becoming a little bit redundant. After all the running gear on most of the American vehicles is pretty much derived from each other. So in this case, the M10's running gear comes from the M4 Medium, the M4 Medium has developed from the M3 Medium, and so on and so forth. However, at least the hull on this is not actually an M4, although it was derived from it, so we'll start there. So the purpose of the tank destroyers were they were supposed to be more mobile than the tanks that they supported. As a result, the armor on this is thinner as a concession to mobility. It's only 1.5 inches, stoked at 55. Outside of that though, most of the other features common to the American tanks you'll see behind brush guard, the siren and service light, marker light. As we start moving back, you can see the hatch is a bit of a design flaw. You can't open or close it if the gun is to the front. Oops. There is no hull MG. Tank destroyer branch basically found its surplus requirements, and it would blur the line a little bit too much between basically an anti-tank gun and a tank. Not having an MG certainly reduced the temptation to play tank. Indeed though, the T-49 early concepts did have a bow machine gun. Eventually, tank destroyer branch decided surplus to requirements. The casting at the front for the nose, which covers the final drive, is pretty much standard design of the era. And finally, I will point out the blindingly obvious here. This is a British vehicle, the 17-pounder, of course, being the British gun. These are American markings. No, I cannot explain why somebody in the past time painted this up as an American tank destroyer. The Americans did consider the 17-pounder conversion to be a good conversion. They liked it. However, because the 90mm could be dropped into the M10 just as easily, effectively making the M36 predecessor, there was no need for the Americans to take the 17-pounder conversion. The 90mm was in production, they already had ammunition, so for basically the same reasons that the British went with 17-pounder, the Americans were very happy to continue with the 90, which in fairness was a better gun anyway. The tracks are common to the HVSS vehicles. They're 16 and 9/16 of an inch wide, 6-inch pitch. They're double pin, they're connected by end connectors, which also function as the guide horns. The bogies themselves, 3 per side, each of which has 2 wheels with the distinctive vertical volute springs within them. Now, the bogies could be replaced either as entire components or as individual pieces within the bogie. To give you an idea of the tension that goes on these springs, if you wanted to replace just one of the volute springs, you needed 2 5-ton jacks to do it. The system itself, if you wanted to remove the whole bogie, there are 16 bolts on the inside. So firstly, you would have to break track above the bogie, just make sure that it's not resting on either the return skid or the support roller. By the way, that's also the indicator this is a heavy-duty bogie, a later model as opposed to the earlier one, which just had the return roller on top. Track's broken, undo the 16 bolts, out it comes, placed on the new unit, 16 bolts back on, connect the track, you're done. Now, this is one of the advantages of the bogie system. It is very, very easy to replace due to battle damage or anything else. The other advantage is that it takes no room inside the hull at all. There are no springs, no bars or anything else. And this is part of the reason that the Germans were very fond of leaf spring suspensions as well, such as on the Panzer IV. However, of course, the bogie system does come with some disadvantages. In this case, especially on the VVSS, the amount of travel that you have. Now, to give an example of the problem, although this vehicle is rated to cross a 7.5-foot trench, it is, according to the manual, limited in the maximum height of a wall that it can cross at 18 inches. A vehicle like this not being able to cross higher than 18 inches is what I would call pathetic. And if you think about it though, because of the way the wheels will travel on their support arms, anything bigger than that is basically going to function as a chock block when it hits the wheel. Now, if you did add the grousers, then what you could do is scale, according to the manual, a 36-inch wall. which is a little bit better, but then you got to go through all the hassle of adding the grousers and so on, which a lot of times they didn't bother with. The other obvious difference between the M4 hull and that of the M10 is that the sides are angled outwards. Now, to reduce weight, they were reduced to 3/4 of an inch in thickness. However, to add a little bit more protection, you have them at an angle. The catch, well, there's actually two of them. Firstly, obviously, the vehicle is now wider. This can lead to some difficulties in either narrow roads or railway loading gauges and so on and so forth. The other